Welcome to 2819. I'm Brian Rohenbacher. Sandra couldn't make it in for the intros today, so I'll be doing the rundown all by myself, but it's still going to be a great episode. In RTB 101, Krista Bontrager will be chatting with philosopher and theologian Ken Samples about the power of a home library. And in Give and Take, Jeff will be talking with astrophysicist Hugh Ross, discussing black carbon and climate change. Now, as you know, climate change is a hot topic. It's always being talked about and debated, so we just want you to feel equipped to talk about these conversations. So I really hope you enjoy that segment. First up, we have Culture Talk. Sandra will be talking with Jeff Zweerink about the scientific and theological look at a multiverse. I'm a big fan of science fiction and science fantasy, and I always love stories about the multiverse, so this segment's really going to be fun for me, and I hope it's fun for you too. Let's check it out.
Now it's time for Culture Talk, where we discuss culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. And I'm joined today with astrophysicist Jeff Zweerink. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Sandra. Looking forward to our conversation.
You know, I'm sure that you went to college and got your PhD in astrophysics so you can talk about Loki, the new show on Marvel Disney Plus, right?
Yes, absolutely. Well, especially since I wasn't even really aware of the Marvel Universe when I was in graduate school.
No, you know what? Well, we are going to be talking about it, but more so how it relates to the multiverse. So I swear there's a connection.
Right.
But yeah, you know what? That show just came out, and it's all about this kind of time variant, which leads us to think about like multiple universes. And
Right.
of course, like in pop culture, when we think multiple universes, we think, oh, there's another Sandra and another Jeff, and
Right.
they're on a whole other show. Or, you know, they've got pink hair on him and brownish hair on her, you know?
Right.
So it's like totally different
Right.
person available doing different things. But that's not what a scientist would think of multiple universes, right?
Well, it depends, because there's actually different kinds of multiverses out there. And so, you know, what I found as I was starting to think about this is that if you're going to talk about a multiverse, you better define the universe first, because, you know, one verse, multi means multiverses. What do you mean when you talk about a universe? Well, the way I can define that in an objective, definable way is that if you talk about here on Earth, there is a most distant reach where stuff from there could actually influence Earth. And it's a very large region, but nonetheless we can calculate it. It's about 100 billion light years across. And so we can define that as the observable universe. And that exists because light has a finite speed and the universe is about 14 billion years old. So if we say that's our universe, that's the universe, then the multiverse is just anything beyond that.
Right.
And so, you know, if you talk about inflationary cosmology, it just says there's more stuff out there, more of the same stuff. Well, that's one kind of multiverse. That's a level one multiverse in a terminology that I like. Or it could be that our universe is part of this large bubble, vast expanse, and there are other bubbles out there. That'd be a level two multiverse. Or it could be every time quantum mechanics makes a decision, quote unquote, makes a decision, you get another universe. That's kind of the Back to the Future. Actually, the Loki one here would pertain to that one. And then there's a kind of a catch-all category of any other way you could think of a multiverse. So there's lots of different ways that we can think about a multiverse or describe it. And each of those has different ways of interacting with the science.
Wow, so 4 different levels of multiverse.
Well, that's one characterization that I think is a pretty handy way to look at it. I've seen anywhere from 1 up to 10. So,
oh wow!
But you know, scientists like making up names for things, so it's not surprising.
Well, and it's really neat to think then of kind of the variance of what one would think when they say multiverse. So let me make sure I'm capturing it. So level 1 would be like anything outside of our observable universe.
Right.
Level 2 is we are one of many multiverses or universes. Level 3 is almost like a choose your own adventure. You go this way and it creates one.
More or less,
way, and then level 4 is like catch-all potpourri. Multiverse.
Yeah, it has to do with the different way you can put the mathematics together. But kind of a good description, you know, Star Wars is a level 1 multiverse. Long time ago, galaxy far, far away. Go far enough away, you get another one. Almost kind of the Marvel universe is almost that level 2, that there's different bubbles and occasionally they align and interact, whereas in ours they never align and interact. But that's more that concept.
Right, and then like Loki is kind of like the level 3 because you have these, well, here you create, and in this instance you broke time into like different branches.
Right. Well, and historically, if you're, Back to the Future is kind of that sort of idea too.
Right. So when we think about the existence of multiple universes, from a Christian perspective, Christians might feel like, well, if there is another universe, then there's nothing special about our universe, our solar system, our planet, and us. So how do we view that from a Christian perspective and do that without fear?
Well, and I think this is where kind of your worldview and how you come into that makes a big difference, because if you have a naturalist universe or naturalist worldview, then ultimately we're just an assemblage of atoms. You take all the atoms, electrons, all the parts, put them together with the right velocities and momenta, and you get Jeff Zweerink, because my consciousness and everything is just a reflection of the physical state. Well, if that's true, this level 1 multiverse that we think of scientifically, the way inflation, it generates a large enough space that conglomeration of atoms is going to replicate somewhere else. Well, that means Jeff Zweerink's going to be here and there. Whereas in a theistic worldview, typically you've got this mind-body dualism. There's the physical part of Jeff Zweerink, but there's also a spiritual part. So if you get all the atoms arranged somewhere else, unless God imparts the Spirit, it's just this thing that kind of looks like Jeff Zweerink, but Jeff Zweerink is here where God. So a lot of your worldview plays into that. And this is where I find the multiverse. It's not that I can say, oh, the multiverse doesn't exist or whatever, but you can start thinking about these worldview issues, and that's a great conversation, because now I don't have to convince people, oh, the multiverse doesn't exist. We just say, if it does exist, well, what do we do about identity? Jeff, what do we do about justice and ethics? These have big, important things, and people like to talk about those sorts of topics.
Right. And, it is interesting to think then about like the spiritual component. So almost like a carbon copy, but not quite, just like a knockoff Jeff Zweerink. Maybe he's a little shorter or something. So when we think about really engaging in conversations about something like this, the multiverse, I think one of the things we need is kind of like a bare bones understanding of what science says today. So what does science say today about the existence of a multiverse? Have they affirmed it, that it does exist, or it's like, well, it potentially exists, but we don't know, and we will never know, or we're on the verge of knowing? Like, where does it land?
Well, so what I would say is, if you're dealing with the level 1 and level 2, this kind of rankles a fair number of people, but if inflation happened, we live in a level 1 multiverse. The way inflation works generates a whole bunch of space-time beyond what we can ever see, what we ever will see. And so if inflation happened, we live in a level 1 multiverse. We have mechanisms for how we think inflation will work. If those mechanisms work, almost every one of those mechanisms we can conceive of produces a level 2 multiverse. So the idea that a multiverse is out there, at the very minimum, is a scientifically very plausible idea. Now, the challenge you have is, I'm fairly confident that we live in a multiverse. I'll just say that. You get different scholars on our RTB Scholar team have different takes on that. So I'm pretty confident that a multiverse exists. The problem is I can never tell you what the rest of the multiverse looks like, because I will never be able to measure it. So I can tell you that it's out there, but I don't know what it looks like. It could look identical to what we see. It could be a vast, voidless, structureless region where this is the only thing that has anything like people and galaxies and stars and planets. And that's where your worldview, what you bring into it, often dictates what it looks like. But we have no way of scientifically measuring what it looks like. And that's a challenge scientifically, but again, a way to engage the conversation well as a Christian.
I appreciate that, because I think it'll help people to avoid kind of scoffing at the possibility that we live in one, when science is kind of saying, hey, if this and this, then probably this. So I think that's a good approach. Where can people go to find more information? Because I know that this is not enough. Like, if they're curious about it, they're going to want to know more.
So if you go, I've actually written a booklet, Who's Afraid of the Multiverse? And it's
not me.
It's generally, here's kind of why we think the multiverse is out there. A good place to start. Also, if you go to reasons.org, look for Multiverse Musings. I've written a bunch of articles about a bunch of different topics on this. So 2 good places to start right there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that, Jeff. So again, if you want more on this topic, go to reasons.org and search for Multiverse Musings.
Now it's time for RTB 101, where we discuss practical questions to equip you to share your faith more effectively. And here to help me talk about the importance of having a home library. I'm so excited to talk about this, is philosopher and theologian Kenneth Samples. Welcome, Ken.
Hello, Krista.
So great to have you here. And, I think if I remember right, I've heard you say before that your mother was the one who really instilled in you a love for reading and learning. I'm wondering how she did that.
Yeah, my mother was the reader in the family. I remember I have a distinct memory, Krista, of coming home in third grade, and my mother was at the ironing board, ironing our clothes, and she had a book that she was reading through, and she read all through the book. And I just have this memory that my mother read. She was interested in history. Her favorite historical figure was Abraham Lincoln. And I spent more time with my mother. She shaped me in many, many ways.
That's so beautiful. I love it when we have those childhood memories that maybe our parents didn't even realize left such an impression on us, and yet they helped shape us in powerful ways. And I know that you spend a lot of time reading every day. You are just a voracious reader. Sometimes you like to revisit some of your favorite books.
Right?
But recently you did a blog post on the importance of having a home library. Tell us a little bit about that research.
Yeah, this was a very fascinating study. It was done over 20 years, which is a very long time to do a study. It covered 70 different countries and with differing governments, some in democracies, some under apartheid, some under communist governments. And they raised the question of what kind of influence does a home library have on the ultimate success or the extended education of children. And it was fascinating because essentially it argued that having a home library of, let's say, 500 books, that weighed as much as having parents who had graduate school educations. And they were shocked by this. And in fact, most of the benefits that were really derived were people who had fairly uneducated parents. And so having a home library can set a child's mind on fire.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me because when you think about educational advancement, I know that your mother, I believe her name was Violet, if I remember right.
That's right.
She didn't have, a graduate school education.
Right.
I believe, your parents were from back east, and they didn't have a lot of education, and yet through her example, she was able to inspire you to advance in your education. And this home library situation may actually help overcome some socioeconomic factors in low income areas to help compensate for that. Is that right?
That's exactly right. In fact, they say that, as I mentioned, the children who had parents with the least level of education benefited the most. It was almost extending their educational level by 3 full years.
That's so fascinating. And now I'm wondering then to what degree, and if the study looked at, to what degree parenting styles sometimes factor into this when you have a parent like your mom who you observed watching her read and learn and be a lifelong learner. Did that play into how successful the children were?
Yeah, a point that I raise in my article is that we want to be careful about correlation and causation. I mean, after all, parents who are pretty well educated, they see the value of education. And so the books may not have been the cause. It may have been the genuine curiosity of the parents. But I don't think that plays out because, again, the people that really it helped the most were parents who didn't have that much education. And so, having books in the home and, that is a great opportunity for people to read. C.S. Lewis said he was born in a library, that he had all these books and it deeply shaped his imagination. You know, the American home has about 112 books. I mean, what if we made reading and books and libraries more available? What if it was right there, you know, right outside your bedroom? That can really set a child's mind on fire, which is what I deeply believe in.
I have to admit that it gives me a lot of pleasure when my children who are in high school and college come to me for books. You know, they're working on something and they will come to me because they know that I have invested, you know, in a couple thousand books and that I can help them and they see me as a resource. I think the same could be true. Like if people can't afford a lot of books, really emphasizing a library, and even churches. Like I think one of the most underrated resources in many churches are libraries. And, you know, that we can encourage children to read through our example, through what we prioritize, and making those books available, even if we can't necessarily afford to invest in all those books in our home.
That's exactly right. There are a lot of things we can do. Churches have opportunities to do this. You know, there are lots of wonderful libraries where you can check books out. So you can make a real difference in the life of a young person. And, you know, Christianity is a faith that comes from the people of the book. And so books and faith go well together.
It's so true. And I'm just was so glad when I saw this post. It's a very fun topic, very provocative and practical topic for many of us as Christian parents, as we find ourselves living in an increasingly hostile culture that's hostile toward our faith. Bringing a lot of the classic books is just a wonderful way of helping to pass on the faith to our children. And I want to encourage everyone, go look for Ken's blog. It's called Reflections, and you can search for it at reasons.org.
Hello, Jeff Zweerink. Welcome back to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we explore important scientific ideas and look at how they relate to the truth of Christianity. Today I'm joined by Hugh Ross, founder and president of Reasons to Believe, and we're going to look at black carbon and how it relates to climate change. Hugh, it's good to have you here today.
Well, thank you.
So that's probably a term that maybe not everybody's familiar with. So why don't you kind of tell us what black carbon is and where do we get it?
Well, it's basically soot. Have you ever done a barbecue or had a fire burning in your chimney? It's the soot.
So when you get all the black stuff around the fire ring,
Yeah.
presumably incomplete combustion, and so it just kind of sprays
Exactly.
that stuff
So
up.
small black particles.
So what are kind of some of the sources that we get from that? I mean, there's not a whole lot of campfires going on, so there's got to be something else that contributes to that.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of places in the world where they get their heat from burning wood,
Okay.
get their heat from burning coal. You got power plants that burn coal. That will produce black carbon soot.
So when we're talking about black carbon, how does that relate to climate change? Because think of climate change, that's what's going on in the atmosphere.
Well, it all began by recognizing that the Canadian North is warming about 5 times faster than the rest of the world. And they said it can't be carbon dioxide. It's got to be more than, because, you know, greenhouse gases tend to evenly distribute,
Okay.
at least to some degree. And so they said, well, maybe it's the fact that all the people living in the Arctic are burning wood.
Okay.
And so they thought maybe that's the source. So they put up stations all over the Arctic, and they found that only an extremely, like less than 1% was coming locally.
Well, I mean, it kind of makes sense. There's just not a ton of folks up there.
There's not a
to
lot of
start with.
people.
That's-
They're not burning that much. They're not producing electricity from the wood. So, but they confirmed that, yeah, I mean, there is a very tiny amount that's local, but the vast majority must be coming from somewhere else.
So they are measuring that there's black carbon up there. It just wasn't coming from the local population.
It wasn't coming from the local population. They thought it might be coming from the oil wells up there,
Okay.
where they're burning off natural gases. No, that's not it either. But they're able to determine where it was coming from.
Okay.
They had enough stations lined up that they could kind of backtrack the wind patterns.
Okay.
And they discovered that almost all of it was coming from Southeast Asia. India, China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, the nations around the Southeast Pacific Rim.
So the black carbon's coming from somewhere not in the Pacific, or up in the Canadian North. What's the impact of that? Before we talk about where it's coming from and the implications, why is it a problem up in Canada?
It's a problem because they have a lot of snow and ice there.
Okay.
And snow and ice normally reflects sunlight with 50 to 70% efficiency. You drop a lot of black carbon soot on it, and suddenly it's reflecting sunlight, let's say, with 30% efficiency. It can even go down all the way to 5% efficiency, which means all that snow and ice is melting at a much more rapid rate than it normally does. And if you melt it all away, you now expose the ground, and ground typically reflects sunlight with, say, 10 to 30% efficiency. So this means that instead of the Arctic reflecting away most of the sunlight, it's absorbing a lot of the sunlight, and that explains why northern Canada is warming 5 times faster than the rest of the world.
Oh, okay, so let's just kind of walk through, because I think that's a pretty important thing. So you got Canada that's largely covered in snow and ice, or at least as you get far enough north, reflects all the sunlight. So whereas carbon dioxide would trap the heat in, the snow would reflect it out. The soot is actually basically absorbing it, kind of like a black street on a snowy day. It's going to absorb more sunlight that way.
The difference between wearing a black T-shirt and a white T-shirt, I mean, that gives you kind of a good idea of what it's like. And it's also happening in western or eastern Siberia. Not quite to the same degree in Canada, but it's also taking a big temperature hit. And you've probably heard about how they had heat waves in Siberia, where it's normally very cold. So they're now realizing, hey, it's coming from the Southeast Asian countries.
So that it's kind of seems to have two things. One, it's there's kind of a global aspect to that, because we're talking a lot in the United States, particularly about reducing CO2 emissions. That seems important, but it seems like this carbon soot is something beyond our control. So there's that one aspect. But I guess the question I want to ask first is, how big a deal is this black carbon compared to carbon dioxide? Is it kind of similar scale, or is it less or more? How would you answer that?
Okay. The climatologists are trying to measure that. What they now realize is black carbon soot is a major contributor, not a minor contributor, to the climate we see in Siberia and Canada. Whether it's greater than CO2, they haven't figured that out yet. I think it probably is, but those measurements need to be made. And now that they realize, okay, we're getting a lot of black carbon soot from Southeast Asia, there's a lot of electricity power plants that are burning coal. And so they're saying, maybe what we could do, we have the measurements telling us this is a big factor, probably bigger than CO2. How about if we approach those Southeast Asian countries and saying, how about getting your electricity from burning natural gas instead of coal? Because when you get electricity from natural gas, there's no black carbon soot. And the really big advantage is you only release half the carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So it actually you're still burning fossil fuels, but you're releasing a whole lot less carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and no black carbon soot. It's one of the easiest things we can do economically and quickly to reduce global warming.
I mean, that just almost seems like a no-brainer. I mean,
It's almost,
you're
yeah,
burning
it really is.
You're burning a cleaner fuel. You're generating power more cleanly. You're getting rid of carbon dioxide. So, I mean, what is it that do you have any sense of what is it that would keep a solution like that from being actually implemented?
I don't really see a barrier. I mean, you'd have to ship the natural gas overseas, but we got the means to do that.
Okay.
We got the shipping to do that, and you're shipping coal anyway. So it's like, it's not going to cause any more energy to ship natural gas than to ship coal. And there's a huge amount of natural gas sitting in North America. So the supply is there. And I think you could even deliver it cheaper than you could coal. So you could actually produce the electricity for less money, and you wouldn't have the carbon dioxide release you would, and would really help the Arctic.
So from an apologetic perspective, as a Christian, how would you think about this? What's the apologetic significance of this?
Well, the apologetic significance is what you see in Job and Genesis, how God gave human species responsibility. manage the resources of this planet I gave you for your benefit and the benefit of all other life, which is basically telling us there will be win-win solutions if you look for them. And this is a very easy win-win solution to implement. And the good news is we don't have to wait 10 years. We can implement it right now.
Well, thanks very much, Hugh. I appreciate your comments. You know, it's just impossible to look at the news today without hearing about global warming and realizing the implications that this phenomena has and how important it is to deal with it well. And what is remarkable is that God has orchestrated this world so that there's abundant resources, but also solutions to these problems that both benefit humanity and the life which we're charged to care for. You know, I would encourage you to go to reasons.org. Hugh's written a great blog on this. It's called Black Carbon's Link to Climate Change. We'll help you understand how black carbon works and how we can mitigate this and actually solve climate change, at least in the near future, in a very effective way. Go check out the blog, read it, be equipped so that you can share the gospel to those God brings across your path.
That does it for us this week on 2819. We hope you enjoyed this episode and that it helped equip you to share your faith with confidence and compassion. If you'd like to stay up to date on what's going on with us, new episodes and all that, make sure you find us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at 2819show. Also, if you're just finding us and maybe you want the podcast version, you can get it on most major podcast services. Just search Reasons to Believe Podcast. Again, we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next time.